slightly less obvious. Generally speaking though, if I come to another shot, let's come to this shot here, what I would be trying to do is make sure that information is comfortably within that range of standard dynamic range of contrast that I have available to me. So I would be adjusting what known as my master wheels. So you can see here in my primary wheels, my master wheels, which I also have replicated on the control surface in front of me. These allow me to place my shadows and my highlights, and I would be looking as a first kind of run over this to make sure that my shadows were just sitting down on black, nowhere sort of below it. I want to keep any detail that's there in those shadows. And with this shot, I have a light, and that is sitting just under 100 IRE, or in the case of the scope I'm using now, which is actually a 10-bit data scale, it's showing me 0 to 1023. Those are shades of grey, so that's based on a 10-bit signal, 1024 different shades of grey, and that's just what Resolve uses. Most other programs actually use what's known as an IRE scale, where it's 0 is black and 100 IRE is broadcast safe white, which maps exactly the same as this. I could change the scale of this graph. The traces won't change. It's just the unit of measurement that you're using, basically. But I have the inside of that light comfortably sitting just underneath 100 IRE. So this is what I mean. I can pull those highlights up and I can sit them comfortably there. And that is the brightest thing in the frame. Now let's just pretend that this wasn't in the shot, the inside of this lamp wasn't in the shot, and all we had was the table. Well, the next brightest thing, actually, I think probably is just this little bit of light coming in here. If I push that all the way up, is that necessarily reflective of the scene? Don't arbitrarily push whatever happens to be the brightest thing in your scene, which, for example, could be my skin, or it could be something else in your scene that's not meant to be 100% IRE white. Don't just push whatever happens to be the brightest thing all the way up the top. You have to place things intelligently. What helps is if you have a bright diffuse white like fluffy clouds, or you know, a white piece of paper with light reflecting off it. Those things actually naturally do fall around about 100 IRE, so they're really useful to help you with your placement, and that's one of the main reasons why we use these color charts, because they give us a 90% reflectance, because actually it's almost impossible, in fact I think it is technically impossible to produce a printed material that's 100 IRE. So a 90 IRE reference here, and it's that reference that helps us know where things should live. So if you have an object that falls around 100 IRE, that's really useful for placing that. But if you don't just think, well, what's the brightest thing, and push it all the way up there, because it's going to look a bit weird and it won't be sort of representative of your actual scene's contrast. The last job then is just to redistribute the mids, again to kind of give it an accurate, you can start to lean in the direction of what look you might be going for, but really you're looking for accuracy, and certainly something that's repeatable in other shots where we see similar objects, because that helps us with our continuity, as I said. So I'm bringing it up, and I'm comfortably sitting my highlights just under 100 IRE, and I'm bringing up my shadows, or bringing down my shadows, but I'm making sure that they are comfortably sitting and just resting above 0. So we're making sure that we're not losing information, we're going to make life difficult for us later on. Even if that's, as I said, even if that's the look we'll push in later on, right now we're looking for a kind of a technical grade, something that's easily repeatable for continuity's sake later on. Once we then have placed and sort of pinned our shadows and our highlights, what's really good is then to use those mid-tone controls. So I'm using the what's known as the gamma master wheel. So that gamma allows me to redistribute the bulk of the image, actually the mids and an awful lot up and down above that. And it's allowing me to kind of essentially set the clarity for the image, and it's helping me, you know, determine, is my image sort of crisp and got deep blacks and bright highlights and then a nice spread of contrast in between? Am I really pushing things down? Maybe this is a low key or a high key image. I can sort of shift the weight of the image up and down, and that's where the mids are so useful, because your whole image essentially is going to sit in the mids. The black and whites are kind of going to sit right at the top there, but the mids is where you've got most control over the majority of tones within your image. So it's a key moment for you to kind of think about how you're distributing those mids, or as Resolve refers to them in this case, your gamma, as well as the master wheels to allow us to do that. We can also use some of the interface. So we've got here our curves. Curves are a classic way for redistributing your tonal range across your image, and it uses a very simple technique. It's a straight line going diagonally from bottom left to top right, and what it's showing me is black in the bottom left and white in the top right. Now what's cool about that is I can move my highlight point either down or across to move that up, so I can place that exactly where I want those highlights to appear. So I can see I'm clipping my highlights if I go there, so I can bring that back to, it's actually almost in exactly the right place again, because the team who shot this have done a fantastic job. My shadows, again, I can bring them and I'm losing detail, or I can raise them, and actually again they're pretty much sat more or less where they should be. I've also got the ability to then click in the middle and I can add control points, and then these can move and adjust. So you can see I'm adjusting my midpoint. This is my gamma again. So I can raise up or lower down to redistribute the bulk of the image in that gamma, in that mid-tone area. If I move that control point down, I'm really dealing with the sort of darkest parts of the mids. If I bring it up, I'm dealing with the lightest parts of the mids. And I can also obviously add more control points, so I could push up the overall kind of upper half of the image, but then also pull down the lower half of the image, giving this classic kind of S curve, which is allowing me to kind of maximize my contrast and give us deep, rich blacks and deep shadows with textures, and then bright highlights and highlight detail. And it's essentially giving me a pleasing high contrast look. That's a classic S curve that you might do. But I can do that however way I see fit. Again, keeping in mind that we're early on in the grading process and we're wanting to create something that's repeatable later on and allows us to kind of accurately place where these objects kind of are falling in their reflective sort of value in the scene, basically. So curves are a really crucial tool that's within your system. So I can control that through the panel, or I can control it through the mouse using the software interface. So there's a couple of different options again there, but however I'm doing it, I've got a kind of a range of movement that I can produce, both in the low parts and the high parts and everything in between, but I'm spreading out. So I'm essentially taking something, particularly if it starts out log, I'm taking something and I'm kind of manipulating it. I always feel like the analogy here is dough. I think I said this to someone recently. It's a bit like, in fact I said it to Philip Bloom yesterday, that's why I'm thinking of it. So it's kind of like this pizza that you're stretching out of the dough. You're pushing things and you're molding a shape for your overall look of contrast, and you're pushing it where it needs to go and redistributing it with a mind to thinking, can I accurately recreate this? Can I create 20 other pizzas like this? Can I recreate this contrast easily across my scene so that the continuity is there, so that I don't have it jumping around as it moves from shot to shot to shot.
The Nick Scarley half-yearly clearance is on now. Limited stock for a limited time.
So with the Nick Scarley commercials, the brief is to make the product actually pop off the screen. So we've tried quite a few different ways of lighting to make stuff happen. So we've gone from occasionally having very light backgrounds and then having, so the couches then pop that way, to what this commercial that you've looked at, which is much darker. And then what we do is we light the couches up and then use pools of light. The interesting thing that made a big change to us is that we've started using sky panels to light, and that's changed our lighting a lot. From, we were using 6K HMIs and it was all 6K HMI Fresnels in the background. But now we're using the sky panels. The sky panels have opened up a whole new way of lighting, because what we can do is we're actually dialing a lot more color into the background. So if we actually want to color wash the whole background, that's what we're adding into it. And that's something would be a lot harder to pull off in post-production, because you then might end up having to mask the couch to stop that changing, all that kind of stuff. So the sky panels open up an interesting way to lighting. And it's not just the sky panels, it's just a different way of lighting with the LEDs. So I've found now you can be a lot more precise in the way you bring it up, and you can put in little pools. Mixing those in with the HMIs, it really makes the product start to pop off the screen. So, that's what we're trying to achieve. So, when they're sitting at home watching the TV commercial, bang, off it goes. We used to shoot the Nick Scarley stuff on a techno crane, which I love the move, and I did it so everything moved a lot more. And it's interesting that, I always had a battle with the client about, keeping the product. I wanted to go in tight, and that's how the techno crane worked really well. This time round, we've actually gone from a much simpler approach with a circle track, And I put up a resistance to it, but now having seen the commercials, I understand why the client wants it. And it's sort of funny, we always have a tug of war over which way we're going to go with it. But that's what they want. The product needs to pop, and you need to see every single piece of detail in it.
We can go to adjust contrast, and I mean, actually it does more or less the same thing, but with one really crucial difference. So this is actually specific to DaVinci Resolve. I've deliberately made this course so that you can apply all of this knowledge to whatever you choose to use to color grade your images. However, it would be ignoring the elephant in the room if we didn't say that Resolve is obviously one of the leading bits of color grading software that's out there. And it has a bit of an ace up its sleeve because it allows you to make contrast adjustments in two very distinctly different ways. With the master wheels in the primary wheels section, we are making technically RGB adjustments to adjust contrast, and that might sound paradoxical, but if 000 in RGB is black, and if 255, 255, 255 are the RGB values of white, essentially any time you have level equal amounts of red, green and blue channels, you have either black, white or a shade of grey. If you want to lighten or darken an image, you can bring those all up or all down. So if you want a lighter grey, you'd bring them all up. If you want a darker grey, you'd bring them all down. Now, if those RGB values are at different heights, you have a colour, there's some kind of hue in there. But that doesn't change the fact that if you bring them all up or all down, you're still going to have a change in contrast. And so when you're actually adjusting your primary wheels with the master wheels, which is adjusting the contrast, you are, in fact, changing the red, green and blue channels all up or all down. That's actually the way that most software packages adjust brightness. When you're adjusting the shadows, midtones and highlights in Premiere, or you're adjusting the exposure controls in Final Cut Pro 10, or whatever program you're using, they're all actually doing RGB adjustments to do that. There is a potential pitfall with that, and that is that if you are changing contrast by adjusting the color channels, as you'd probably expect, there is a knock-on effect on the hues and on the intensity of the hues in your image. So if I start adjusting, let's say, the gamma with this shot that I have up at the moment, as I start to adjust it, you can actually see, because it explicitly shows you in the interface with Resolve, that along here, the bottom here, it says YRGB, and all of those are changing, and specifically what we're interested in here is the RGB bit. So you can see they're all going up and they're all going down. So clearly there are color channels being manipulated here. So if we take, for example, this shot here, you can see if I open up the vector scope, now admittedly we haven't actually looked at the vector scope yet, that's coming in the next lesson, but suffice to say for now that if those traces in the middle of the vector scope get bigger, then saturation is coming into our image, and if they're getting smaller, then saturation is being taken away from our image. If I adjust my gain, for example, on this image where we've got a nice tan-coloured sofa, if I brighten this image up and darken it, you can see in the image itself, in the viewer, that it's getting brighter and darker, but look at the vector scope. You can see it growing and shrinking. So a clear demonstration that colour is changing, and in this case it's the intensity of the colour, so the saturation is changing, and that's because we are actually bringing up the colour channels. Because the colour channels are coming up, the saturation is going up. Where Resolve has a distinct advantage over other programs is that it, in the primary bars, has a repetition of this, and it looks almost like this is going to do the same thing. In fact, it even has the same master wheels running along the bottom, which are still patched in the same way to the outer ring on the control surface. But if these are going to carry on doing that effect where we have saturation going in or going out, so as it gets lighter or darker, we see the saturation changing, and you don't want that to happen, we can individually grab the Y only lift, gamma and gain control. So Y means in this case the lightness or the luminance channel. So it's brightness only, and you can see the red, green and blue channels don't change. You can see 0, 0, 0. If I change the gain, we have 1, 1, 1. It doesn't change at all. And if you look at the vector scope, you can see there's a slight shift. There is a slight knock-on consequence, just as areas of the image become crushed or clipped, then hues are disappearing essentially. But you can see it's not increasing its saturation or decreasing its saturation as wildly as it was when I was doing it with the main primary wheels and with the master wheels. So having two different ways of adjusting your contrast is incredibly useful. So if you're grading a log image, for example, I would always make my contrast adjustments, or the bulk of them to begin with, in the primary wheels, because there's a knock-on benefit, because the saturation will be being pushed into the image anyway. So it gives you less to do with the sat control or color boost or whatever you need to do. If you have an image that's already saturated just how you want it and you want to make changes to contrast, then go to your primary bars, use the Y-only channel, and then you can make adjustments just to brightness without any effect, or very little effect, on the saturation of the image. So it's a really sort of unique selling point, I suppose, of the way that Resolve works. Another thing to bear in mind is the zones of influence of these different controls. So whether you're in primary wheels or primary bars, you can see we have lift, gamma and gain here. In fact, there is a slight difference with Resolve because it has a separate log section. The log section, you'll notice that it changes to being called shadows, midtones and highlights. And this is where the zones of influence is most obviously separated in the program. Again, there are ways of doing this in other programs, but they're not quite so explicitly laid out to you. Obviously, Resolve being a dedicated color grading package, there are a few things about the way that it works that are very meaningful to colorists, but you wouldn't necessarily have in a more general suite of tools in, say, an editing package like Final Cut or Premiere. But what I have here is the ability to distinctly affect different ranges of luminance within the image. So with lift, gamma and gain, which are our default ways of controlling contrast, if you like, the most obvious things that you get drawn to first, there's a big overlap very deliberately, and that's because when you start out with a color grade in the early phases, you're doing primary balance changes, and a primary adjustment or a primary grade is something that broadly affects the whole image and allows the whole image to kind of be eased into a nice kind of area where it's ticking most of the boxes. Everything that comes after that is known as a secondary adjustment, where you're picking out specific parts of the frame to adjust. Maybe it's the color of the sofa or the depth of the shadows in the background, and there are all kinds of secondary adjustments that can be made with tools like windows or masks, which is what other programs call them. You've got qualifiers or keys. There are various ways you can produce secondaries, but your primary is the most important step, if you like, because it's that first pass where you're getting it ballpark in the right area. And because that's so early on and you want quite broad changes across the image, you don't want tools that are too specific at that early stage. And so the amount of effect you have on the contrast in your image with, say, lift is actually surprisingly large. You would imagine, because most people think, oh, lift is shadows, gamma is midtones, that it is actually quite different in terms of what you're affecting. With lift, for example, you might presume that when you adjust that, you're just adjusting the shadows, but you're clearly not. We can see here, as I bring it up and down, the whole image is shifting up and shifting down. It's having a diminishing effect. So by the time we get up to the highlights, it is a minimal change, but there is still a change happening there. Now that massive kind of overlap with different areas of tonality across the image is very deliberate. It means that you can make broad changes. So for example, if you're seeing a color cast predominantly in your shadows, well, that color cast is almost certainly going to be in the whole image. So making a change in the area where you see it most, but knowing that you're having a knock-on effect into the whole range of tonality to correct out any color casts is obviously a good thing. Again, it's kind of broad changes across the image in the earlier stages. With gain, it's the exact opposite. So if I start pulling down my highlights, you can see that in fact everything's moving down. Again, it's a diminishing effect. So it's having a minimal effect by the time it gets down to the shadows, but it is an effect nonetheless. And with gamma, it's everything in between. So really, this is the kind of the broadest of the three, and this is why major adjustments to contrast in your image are best left for gamma. So you're doing sort of, as I said before, you're you're pinning your black with the lift, you're keeping detail in the highlights and pinning your white point with the gain, and then actually the bulk of the image is being shifted with your gamma. But you can clearly see the zones of influence here. The range of influence of gamma is clearly shown to affect the vast bulk of the image here. So it's having a maximum effect at, say, 50% IRE, right slap bang in the middle, but it's having an effect all the way up to the top and all the way down to the bottom at a diminishing level as well. That's great, and that's useful for primary, but once you get further down and you want to make more nuanced changes to the range of tonality, this is where in Resolve, the log tools are incredibly useful because you'll see they now shift, the naming convention used here has changed. It's now shadow, midtone and highlight. And this does clearly only affect the bottom, the top, and then everything in between. And what's even more clever about this in Resolve is that I can actually adjust the low range and the high range, so I can determine what part of the luminance is affected precisely by shadows, midtones and highlights. And that's kind of, when you hear those words, shadows, midtones and highlights, that's kind of how you think it should translate. But in truth, most other programs label their lift, gamma, gain, shadow, midtone and highlight because it's more accessible, it's more the simpler terms to understand, but they don't technically adjust just the shadows, just the midtones, and just the highlights, whereas the log color wheels in Resolve actually do. So it's quite an important distinction to remember with the program. So now we've kind of addressed the really sort of basic building blocks of contrast, i.e. setting your shadows, keeping details in there, not losing detail, placing your highlights realistically, but also maintaining detail in those areas, and getting a kind of a safe starting point, a corrective starting point with our technical grade right at the beginning. We can start now to think more, not necessarily creatively, but sort of optimizing our image from a contrast point of view. And I think one of the most kind of obvious uses for this technique would be in interviews. And certainly when you're lighting interviews, it's particularly crucial to think about, a key side and a fill side, and do you have backlights? What's the brightness of your background versus your foreground? And any DP will tell you that they think in terms of ratios. So they're thinking about how bright is my key side versus my fill side, and the playing of that relationship between the two. Those ratios, those lighting ratios, are really important for creating depth within your image, and that's why we do what we do with keys and fills, to make an otherwise kind of two-dimensional image appear three-dimensional and kind of give it depth with light and shadow. So the DP is thinking about these things during lighting and recording, say, an interview. The colorist has another opportunity to kind of maximize that. So I've got here the interview that appears in this training series with Brett Danton, who's the director who directed these Nick Scali commercials that I'm working through right now. And you can see clearly that he has a key side and he has a fill side. But what is interesting to me is how I can optimize that from a coloring point of view. Now, this is sort of slowly getting more towards secondary work, but we're still talking about contrast. We're still talking about how we're using contrast to place our subject versus our background. So you'll notice that the placement of the camera here, actually that was me that shot this, but the placement that I've chosen here was deliberate so that the darker side of his face was up against the brightest part of the background, and then the key side of his face was up against the darkest part of the background. It's giving me that ratio, that difference between the foreground and background, allowing it to kind of stand out, and that's really what my goal was and is with any interview, is to kind of get my subject to almost feel like they're coming out of the screen and give it that real three-dimensionality. Now, once I'm here in the grade, I can actually start to develop that. So actually this is my primary grade, if you like. I've actually spread it across two different sets of corrections. This was shot raw, so there's a technical correction made here to move this into the correct gamma, and then there's also a small correction that's actually you can barely perceive, which is just a slight tweak to skin tones because of the color management that we've done in production and using charts like the X-Rite Color Checker video. It's already very, very close. So there wasn't a huge amount to do with this interview in terms of correcting it, but the contrast was the big thing, obviously going from a raw, from a log gamma to a normal deliverable gamma. This has changed it considerably, but actually the colors were pretty close already. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new node and do just a small amount of secondary work, now that my primary balance is done, just to try and emphasize the depth of the image and really bring out those lighting ratios that I've set in camera and kind of maximize the effect I'm trying to produce with them, which is just simply that Brett kind of stands out and is nice and present and clear in the frame. So I'm going to create what in Resolve they call nodes, which is essentially just another correction. You're just doing essentially a layer, if you like. Each new node is a new opportunity to create a new correction on this source footage. This would be no different to in, say, Final Cut Pro, creating a new correction, or corrector, I think they call them, and it would be no different to in Premiere creating a new adjustment layer or adding on a new, lumetri effect. You're just stacking up effects, essentially, is what you're doing. So by creating a new node, I'm giving myself a new opportunity to work with this, and I'm going to start off very simply by just pumping up the contrast a little bit on the left-hand side. So I want to essentially darken the shadows on the right of his face, left of screen, and brighten the highlights a little bit to just really punch those up. And I don't even mind if I start to clip a little bit through the window here, because quite frankly it's expected. I think people are very used to seeing clipped highlights. It's not some kind of disaster.